Hey photographers, if you're still confused about how aperture affects the exposure of your photos, you're going to want to check out this super quick video. So before we dive in today, I want to make sure that you understand what exactly is aperture. So before we go in, I want you to understand that aperture is referring to how large or how small the opening is in your camera's lens. And you can see an example of this in the image on the right. You see the hole in the middle of that lens, that is the aperture. It is narrow or small. That means that the aperture here is probably a higher number like f14 or f16, because a higher number indicates that we have a more narrow opening in our aperture. So if you're wondering a little bit more about what the numbers mean and how you know what number is what aperture, be sure to check out our video about aperture and what those numbers mean. There are two main impacts of aperture. The aperture impacts the exposure of your image. It is part of the exposure triangle, and the aperture also impacts the depth of field in your image. And in this video today, we're actually going to be talking about how aperture impacts exposure. If you're interested in learning more about how aperture impacts the depth of field or how much of your image is in focus, be sure to check out our video on that in this same series. But today we're talking about exposure, and the aperture is a part of what we call the exposure triangle. The exposure triangle, it consists of the aperture, the shutter speed, and your ISO. And all three of those settings in your camera are what you utilize to make sure that you have a properly exposed photo. So let's talk about what that looks like. The first thing that you want to understand is that when your aperture is open or wider, or that opening is more open in your lens, there's more light that is able to come into your lens. So that makes quite a bit of sense, right? Like if you were in a dark room, and let's say you put a hole in the wall to outside, and if you put a small hole in your wall, you're going to get some light coming in, but it's only going to be a little bit, right? But if you put a larger hole in your wall, you're going to get a lot of light coming in. So think of aperture the same way. You're controlling the amount of light that's coming into your camera's lens, into the camera's sensor, by how much you open or close down that aperture. So when you have your aperture wider open, more light is coming in. When the aperture is closed down or less open or smaller, then of course, less light is going to come in. So this is a perfect example. This is an image. These were taken seconds apart, and the ISO and the shutter speed stayed the exact same. In the image on the left, the aperture was set at 3.5. So that's not a dramatically small aperture, but it is smaller than the image on the right. So the image on the left, we have a more narrow aperture, so there's less light in that image. Now there's a lot of things we could do to adjust the amount of light, again, referring to the exposure triangle, but for this example, I wanted to show you how aperture itself impacts the light. So I left the ISO and the shutter speed the exact same, and all I did was open up that aperture a little bit by taking it to f1.8. And with that wider aperture, I was able to get more light into that photo. So all you have to remember when you are taking a photo and you're not quite sure what aperture means, remember that narrow aperture, you've got less light. So if you want to open that up and get more light, then you can utilize that function to help with your exposure. And if you're still confused about aperture and the numbers and what those mean, be sure to check out our video on aperture and what the numbers mean.